On this episode, we visit Morgantown, West Virginia. Students learn about governance at West Virginia University. Then we learn about the Pedestrian Safety Committee. Finally, we meet the director of the Mon River Trails Conservancy. Stay tuned.
We're at West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia, talking with Margaret Stout. What do you do here at the university?
Well, I teach public administration, and that's in the Rockefeller School of Policy and Politics, so we address all different types of governance issues.
And when you're teaching a course, what would the students be learning about governance? Just what does that mean?
Well, governance is the term we use today instead of government because a lot of what we do ends up being across sectors. So we see policymaking and implementation happening in the borders and boundaries between government and private sector organizations, nonprofit groups, citizens, etc. The approach that I prefer is a collaborative approach that really brings all those stakeholders together to make decisions and make sure that we have a high quality of life.
Where would pedestrians, pedestrian infrastructure, walkable communities, that sort of thing fit into governance?
Great. Well, I teach a series of classes that start with this sort of understanding of governance and a collaboration approach to it. We move then into public engagement, which are all about the skills of bringing citizens into the conversation. And helping them, very much like your series does, help them understand the issues in a more profound way so they can have better impact in their engagement. Then we move into public planning and sustainable community development. So those two courses together are very much framed around physical planning and the impact that our spaces have on our quality of life. Clearly, the integrated perspective on land use and transportation is really the best way to approach those issues. So the notion of sort of walkable communities, of multimodal transportation, it becomes very pivotal within both of those courses.
And you're in a course, talk about the theory behind this, and then you go out real life and look at what's actually going on, here in Morgantown or here in West Virginia. What can the students see once they step out of the classroom and take a look around?
Well, what's really interesting is many of our students are from West Virginia and haven't really experienced other places that have a different sort of approach to complete streets, for example. And so learning about this is a very novel experience for them. And so when they go back out into whether it's Morgantown or the cities that we are working with and the classes, they see it with a new lens. And it's amazing to have that awareness, that awakening of awareness of how bad things really are. I hate to say that. It's, of course, not everywhere, but many places in the state really suffer from a lack of infrastructure for pedestrians and bicyclists.
So how can improvements in governance structure and governance policy in these different communities lead to an improvement in things for pedestrians?
Well, I guess I'm going to give you a bit of a case study in West Virginia, and that might help a little bit. There are clearly advocates in the state that want better planning and infrastructure for pedestrians. They sort of rally behind the notion of complete streets and were able to get the legislature to adopt formal policy. Now, there's no funding behind the policy yet, so it doesn't do very much but say, this is a standard we would like to pursue. And the next steps, I think, for that group are focused on very much what Morgantown is focused on as a city, and that is figuring out the funding. How do we build this vision that we've adopted for ourselves of complete streets, multimodal transportation, creating the infrastructure for healthy lifestyles, walking and biking, et cetera. So that's a huge challenge for us because in the state code, sorry to get a little geeky on the policy stuff here, but in the state code, it is the responsibility for every private property owner to create and maintain sidewalks. And that means that at every city's ordinance level, they've just mirrored that same state code. And they say it's the private property owner's responsibility to construct and maintain sidewalks.
What's the impact of leaving the responsibility for sidewalks on the adjacent private property owner rather than having it built as part of the street?
Generally speaking, it just doesn't happen. Where construction has happened in the past, it's in very, very poor condition because maybe it was part of the construction project, but then the owner, once they've taken possession of the property, these owners don't maintain them. So at this point, we have a really good assessment in Morgantown of the conditions of every street in the city in our pedestrian plan. Most places you'll see no sidewalk, but where the sidewalks do exist, the majority are in very poor condition. To the point where they're dangerous. And sometimes, we on advocacy boards, we wonder how is it that we've avoided lawsuits because it's very, very dangerous in many places.
And there's some other cities where there have been lawsuits. Sacramento comes to mind, the Barden versus Sacramento case, where it's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act to have a sidewalk that's so bad that it's not accessible to people with disabilities. Has the ADA come up in West Virginia in any cases yet?
Yes, in fact, in Morgantown, it's kind of been on the discussion board for about, I want to say, 5 years at this point. The state controls many of our streets because they're state routes of various sorts. And so one of the main routes through town is a state route. They did some widening and replaced the sidewalk, and in so doing, did not meet ADA guidelines. And so there were immediate lawsuits and complaints filed, and they're sort of working their way through the process. I would encourage you to talk with the Pedestrian Safety Board about where that is. But if you look at the sidewalks as they are, they're not wide enough. They don't meet the regulations, and they continue to have utility poles and the like barriers in the middle of the sidewalk that you can't get around. Some of them are hard to navigate for a person walking. They're impossible to navigate in a wheelchair or other assisted device.
Now, is this a case where the department and the construction firms that build these facilities need to have a better understanding of what's needed?
I think they may have an understanding of what's needed. I think that they may not have received sufficient instruction in terms of the repercussions of not meeting those guidelines. It's just been a place where they haven't attended to them for so many decades, and so it's not something that's really on their radar screen.
Then you have the intersection of the federal government and their various policies, the state government and their policies, good or bad, and then your locality. How does a citizen know where to start when they perceive a problem with the infrastructure that makes it tough for them to get around?
The very first thing that they have to do is figure out whose jurisdiction that street is. And that, as you've already pointed out, can be a very messy affair indeed. Especially in West Virginia towns, many of the main roads are either county or state controlled, and the county roads are also state controlled. So even if it's a county road, it's probably the state, et cetera. Just that in and of itself causes many, many problems. For example, here, the city council wanted to pass an ordinance about truck routes, and it had to do with both, neighborhood noise, but also pedestrian safety. We have trucks rolling up over broken curbs onto sidewalks and that sort of thing happening, and they wanted to change the routes for large carriers. Well, it's a state road, and they have no jurisdiction over this, so they can do what they feel politically is right and work with the citizens who have complained and pass an ordinance that has no jurisdictional effect. So that's a problem. We see it not just with the citizens themselves, but the elected officials as well.
your students, they take your courses, they graduate, they go out into the world. Is their improved understanding of governance going to lead to them being more active in their communities and addressing some of these issues and making their local and state governments work better?
Absolutely. I wish I had had the foresight to have a list prepared for you of graduates of our program that do exactly that. We're a land-grant university, which means our mission is to impact the communities we serve. The courses that I teach are all structured around sort of an apprenticeship style where we are working in a host community for 2 years. And so we help that community make the very policy changes that we're talking about right now. We help them put together project plans for initial projects to make those types of infrastructure changes, and et cetera. So I can't point to any that have been constructed inside of the 7 years that I've been here, but I could point to a lot of project implementation plans and grant templates that we prepared for those communities to help them move forward with that. What I do in terms of my own outreach as a faculty member is focused on Morgantown and helping them with policy changes. Right now we're working on the funding strategies to implement the pedestrian safety plan, which would be replacing a lot of that infrastructure that is in poor shape, and also building new infrastructure where it was never created in the first place. And last but not least, really enforcing that policy with all new construction from this point forward.
We're in Morgantown, West Virginia, talking with Stan Cohen with the Pedestrian Safety Committee, which is going to meet in less than half an hour. What is the Pedestrian Safety Committee?
Okay, the Pedestrian Safety Committee is actually a group that advises the Traffic Committee on pedestrian issues. And pedestrian issues, of course, involve primarily safety, having a safe, walkable city, as well as trying to improve the walkability of Morgantown.
What's on the agenda for today's meeting?
Okay, I haven't, we go through a series of reports. We have several people that are associated with us. For example, we have a person from our planning organization, and they usually report on projects that would impact pedestrians. We have a bus line representative who also reports on projects or bus schedules that might affect pedestrians. And then we just have a lot of ad hoc reports. For example, we've been discussing a new housing development that's going to possibly occur on Beechhurst Avenue, which is 2 or 3 blocks down toward the river. And we reviewed the project. It's now in the proposal stage to see how it would impact safe pedestrian crossing and also access to vehicles, how people would get to their vehicles, because everybody's a walker. Even if you drive, you have to park your car and drive somewhere. So those will probably be some of the issues still up. Matt Cross is the chair, and he usually brings some new issues that we have a first reading and then we table and read some more about.
What are the biggest challenges to being a pedestrian in Morgantown?
Well, topography is the biggest, of course. If you walk around our town, we're now in what I guess you would call the River Valley, but once you go 3 or 4 blocks to any side, then you're going to have hills. And so these hills create several problems, particularly in the winter, because once they ice or snow, then you've got some safety issues. The other main pedestrian safety issue is we are a college town, so we have students who live throughout the city, and we're trying to ensure that when they try to walk to campus that they have a safe access route. We're actually working with a group in the city that has a grant. It's called, the group is called Downtown Morgantown, or Mainstream Morgantown, and they're trying to develop a series of safe routes and then go with students who would lead other students so they can become familiar with the safe routes into town, where the sidewalks are in good repair and also where there are good traffic crossings. That's another major problem. If you can tell even here that we have 3 or 4 major streets that are also highways, believe it or not. We have 3 highways that come through Morgantown, and so cars aplenty are coming through the city. So we've been trying to work on having safe crosswalks, and that tends to be not an easy problem because the more crosswalks you have, of course, the slower the traffic. So then you have some pedestrian automobile contention. So we've worked as best as we can with the State Department of Highways there. And of course the city itself is very involved with working with the State Department of Highways.
And then is your role to advise the city or advise the state, or do you talk to anybody you need to, or what's your official role?
Okay, officially, we advise the Traffic Commission because the Traffic Commission then implements or proposes to the city any codes or rules or any action plan that's required. But it turns out that we do meet a lot with other parties related to streets and highways, and primarily to provide input so that when some of these projects go forward, that they will have a pedestrian element. I mean, that, at least the last couple of years, we've realized that a lot of construction, unfortunately, is completed before people have actually got a pedestrian plan, and suddenly people now need to cross the street or there's no adequate sidewalks. So we do try to anticipate projects that will impact pedestrian safety.
And have you found that when you get to the project early and the plans aren't finalized yet, that you can have more of an influence on on a good outcome for pedestrians?
Yes, proactive is always better than reactive. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we succeed every time, even proactively, because there are elements that are beyond our control. For example, there some of the contingencies that private developers have because of costs or where the building entrances are, to some extent contend with what might have been a better plan for the pedestrians. But we found in many cases that developers, of course, are keenly aware of the problem themselves. So they do try to at least take our input and see if there can be some reworking of the plan. A good example is actually in process now. On Beechhurst, which is about 3 blocks down, there's an entire block that over the years has become very dilapidated. So a developer is now coming in to propose a housing complex there. And so we've actually met with the housing group from their development. And they have actually made some changes to their plan. In particular, there might be an elevated crosswalk because Beechhurst is again a state highway and has a lot of traffic. Again, it's too early to tell where that project's going to go. In fact, they still have to meet with the planning commission in the city. And I don't know whether our city is different from other cities. Maybe I should mention this. We have two groups that are involved with new construction or development. One group is called the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission basically approves the concept, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then sometimes the concept requires a change in the zoning requirements, like setback or how much parking is available for the residents. So then they go to the zoning commission, and the zoning commission approves any variances. And we tend to be at the first stage with the planning areas.
And where do you see the committee going in the future? You've learned a few things as you've gone along so far, but over the next several years, where do you want to see the committee go?
Well, I think we are now at the point where we want to really look at infrastructure. When we first formed as a committee, we developed a plan, a citywide plan that would improve both the existing sidewalk structure, but also add what we call connecting network sidewalks. So these connecting network sidewalks allow people to get to primary destinations, for example, shopping, schools, bus lines, and things like that. So, in fact, today we're starting to meet with some of the city officials about that. So we want to try to get some plan in place, and then, of course, some funding mechanisms. Needless to say, like any project you might imagine, funding is always a critical aspect of it. So I would see that certainly over the next year to two, that'll be a primary objective of our committee, is to get some type of action plan in place dealing with building these new sidewalks or improving the existing sidewalks that are also connectors.
We're in Morgantown, West Virginia, talking with Ella Belling. What's your organization?
I'm the director for the Mon River Trails Conservancy. We're a rail trail organization.
What sort of rail trail do you have here in Morgantown?
We have a 48-mile trail system that extends both through the city center of Morgantown, but also goes out into the rural communities that surround Morgantown.
And how well does the trail connect up with the neighborhoods in the city? Do a lot of people go down to use it?
Yeah, it gets thousands of people every year. It gets hundreds of people every day using the rail trails all year long. And it's pretty exciting to see how many people use it to commute to work and to the university and to neighborhood schools. It's also, used mostly probably for outdoor recreation, but people use it to exercise and to host events and do a lot of other community activities on the trail. The neighborhoods are well hooked up, but we actually want to see big improvements in the next 2 years, and we're right now working on some pedestrian and bike bridges that will connect neighborhoods to the trail, as well as using old road right-of-ways that will turn into pedestrian bike ways into neighborhoods and shopping districts. So making some improvements to get more of our communities hooked up so they won't have to use a car to get to the trail.
And you say you have 48 miles. What's the future of the trail? Is it going to go beyond that?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. We actually are part of a massive undertaking that is also involving the National Rails to Trails Conservancy, and with a 5-state, 14,000-mile connection. And the connection in West Virginia will be a 150-mile trail system, and then it'll hook up in Pennsylvania with the Great Allegheny Passage. So at one point or another, we hope in the next, by 2020, we will see people be able to get from Parkersburg, West Virginia, all the way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then on to Washington, D.C.
How'd this all get started? Perhaps before your time, but what's it taken to get this far?
Yeah. Well, nationally, Rails to Trails were a part of a visionary Congress looking at the fact that railroads were going bankrupt in the 1980s, and in order to return to rail use across the country, we needed to preserve and protect the corridors. And so they put in place a Transportation National Trail System Act that would preserve railroad corridors and use them for non-motorized trail use. So when that came about and we saw our railroad company abandoning a section of trail here in Morgantown, the nonprofit formed in about early 90s to negotiate with the railroad company and acquire that corridor and preserve it for potentially future railroad use. But in the meantime, and for the most likely future, it remains to be a rail trail used for non-motorized recreation, and people use it mostly for cycling and running and hiking, and in the wintertime cross-country skiing. Railroads obviously wanted to take the easiest routes to get over mountains, and so the corridor that goes through Morgantown is along the river and is essentially flat. We do have a spur called the Deckers Creek Trail, which is got about a 2% grade and does take you up part of the mountains.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.